Jonathan Turley, professor, is the author of The Indispensable Right, Free Speech in the Age of Rage. He's also a Fox News contributor and the Shapiro Professor of Public Interest Law at George Washington University. And Professor Turley joins us now. Hey, Happy New Year. Great to see you.
Yeah,
First of the year here together. You being such a champion, and you've written this book about free speech and how indispensable it is to, I think, Western civilization, quite honestly. I think you're a perfect person to sort of address Justin Trudeau today. I mean, the reasons for his resignation in Canada are multiple. I think, and probably in no small part by the way Trump has begun treating Canada right away, but also his fallout with his finance minister, Cynthia Freeland. But his legacy, Professor Turley, has to be directly tied to his antagonism to free speech.
Oh, it does. I just posted a column on The Hill talking about precisely that issue, Will. He is one of the most decidedly anti-free speech figures in the world. I've written about him for almost 2 decades. He's been a prime minister for a decade. I wrote about his father before him and his record. But
Fidel
the
Castro?
the book also discusses both him and his father in their crackdowns on free speech. And they used, by the way, the same basic laws to do so. What they did to the truckers was horrendous. I mean, they froze their accounts. They were so over the top. It was shocking, except that the media gave him nothing but kudos and praise. And it led to this moment where we all sort of spit out our soup when the Trudeau government actually criticized Cuba and China for cracking down on protests. And some of us wrote and said, what are you talking about? I mean, the Canadian government just shut down one of the most significant protests in its history on the very same subject that you criticized China over.
Right. But what do you think that's, you brought up his father. Do you think that, I spent some of the beginning of the show today talking about what's going on in the UK when it comes to this story that's breaking. It's been out there for a decade, but what we're learning about these grooming gangs in I don't know, dozens of cities in the UK where this is going on, this young women raped by men of Pakistani heritage, but it's been kind of covered up. And what I'm getting at is how much of what Trudeau did in Canada do you think is unique to him? You brought up his father and his own personal instinct or antagonism towards free speech, but how much of it is also part of, really honestly, every other British colonial relationship with free speech except for America, meaning New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and the UK itself. They don't care about free speech. It is not of value to them.
No, Will, that's a fantastic point. I go into that in The Indispensable Right, because what I discuss is that the First Amendment was arguably the most revolutionary act of the American Revolution. It was the greatest departure from the United Kingdom. And quite frankly, it remains revolutionary. There are law professors who want to amend the First Amendment because they believe it's too individualistic. That's a direct quote from one of my colleagues. Canada shares DNA with both the United States and the United Kingdom. Unfortunately, it took its free speech DNA from the mother country, in this case, United Kingdom. And they have a horrendous record on free speech. Free speech is in a free fall in Great Britain. As you have noted, they've criminalized a great deal of speech. They arrest people even for praying in their minds, just standing there and silently praying. They've arrested people for criticizing homosexuality. Trudeau is the true believer in that cause. He was the smiling, cheerful face of censorship. And the media loved him for it. He and what are called the Human Rights Commissions of Canada became something of free speech commissars. They just recently fined a mayor in a town for not hoisting a gay pride flag during Pride Month. The town mentioned that they don't have a flagpole, but that really didn't matter. The comparison between the United States and Canada on free speech could not be more chilling. But under Trudeau, it became far, far worse. His father had the same authoritarian attitude that you see on the left. that as long as their motivations and virtue are clear, any means is allowed.
But so one more follow up on this, but you've written the book on this. So I'm going to come back to Trudeau in a minute. I want to stay on free speech for a second. So I think that what I said this at the beginning of the show, what undergirds every single thing that comes up in our conversations and honestly our policy and political debates is a cultural debate. That's the most. I am a true believer that culture is the most important thing because it sets the stage for anything else that happens. And so we need to, in America, we need to retain not only a legal protection for free speech, but we need a cultural protection because if we lose the cultural protection, then the judges don't care. Then they'll follow that before they'll follow precedent. I do believe that. There are, you and I are both lawyers, you're a professor, you're an expert on this, but there are principled justices and judges, but I think they're actually in the minority. I don't think most of them say, well, here's the history and the precedent on free speech. It's more finger in the wind. You know, where's the current cultural climate? My point is, I'm curious what the average Canadian thinks of free speech. And is the average American still faithful in the way that we would hope to the cultural concept of defending something that you even hate, specifically that you hate? Because that's the point of free speech, defending what you hate to hear.
No, Will, you put your finger on it. You know, Alexis de Tocqueville once wrote that one of the greatest protections in the United States of liberty is that it's in our culture, that the American people have been raised, they have been inculcated with this great faith in rights like free speech and free association. The question is what happens to us if that culture changes. And you're absolutely correct that in Great Britain, for example, most of the people in Great Britain were raised under a system that does not put free speech as a highly protected right. It is more often abridged than protected. It's treated as a privilege rather than a right. The same is true in Canada. So you can lose that sensation once the limb has been removed. And the question is, can you get it back? Now, obviously, there are many in Canada, particularly conservatives and libertarians, that want their free speech back, and they're going to come looking for it after Trudeau leaves. The question is whether the rest of Canada is going to look at this and say, you know what? There are wonderful things to get from the United Kingdom, wonderful things to get from the United States. But one of the DNA strands that we should probably take from the United States is free speech, because free speech is in a free fall in Canada.
Yeah, and honestly, I don't think Trump is joking, but him talking about Canada becoming the 51st state, like, I'm actually not for that unless we can find some real cultural assimilation and overlap. I mean,
well, I just can't get used to the cheese.
State
I can't get used to the cheese curds, so they're going to have to get rid of the cheese curds and the mayonnaise on French fries before we can consider statehood.
Well, if that's your standard, Professor, you just booted Wisconsin from the Union. So I don't know. That's not just Canada.
Hey, I'm a Bears fan. That's okay with me.
Is that right? Oh, you're a Bears guy, Chicago guy.
That's right.
So one more thing on Justin Trudeau. How, I was just in Florida, Professor, at a soccer tournament. One of the things I love about my sons playing soccer is I'm exposed to a lot of people from different backgrounds. And so one night I was sitting there with two of the dads, and one dad comes from Mexico and the other dad comes from Kenya. And, their kids play soccer and we're talking. And the Kenyan dad was telling me, he's been in America for a long time, but how much of a player in Africa China is. He's like, Will, like, China is everywhere in Africa, like what they're investing in, what they're doing. And then, of course, we're concerned about China's role. And this is what Trump's bringing up with the Panama Canal in Latin America. But Trudeau praised China. Like, Trudeau talked about China as a model for how they handled COVID. I know you said he criticized them at times, but he also looked to them, and there's speeches out there of him talking about their model of governance as a way to drive forward a progressive vision of the future. And I do wonder about that. Like, what's the future of Canada? Did Trudeau set them up on this path of not just, their DNA sharing with the UK, but looking towards an authoritarian East, with China as their model?
Yeah, and it's not just China. I wrote a column last year involving a woman who came from Ukraine, a very brave woman, who was tried in absentia in Russia because she criticized the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so she was going to get citizenship in Canada, and the Trudeau government stopped it. And they said, well, the problem we have is you were convicted in Russia, and the law you were convicted under is much like our own law. And in fact, it is, because the Russians convicted her of spreading false information. There's a Canadian law that does the same thing. And I wrote a column saying, is this the point that even this irony will not wake up the Canadian people? You just held up citizenship of a dissident because you have the same draconian speech laws as Russia. And that doesn't seem to register with Canadians. And I think that is part of the problem of that tradition coming from Great Britain. But you're right, Will. Trudeau was an incredible hypocrite. And his embrace of the Chinese government was chilling.
Yeah. Okay. This is going to be a big week on a multitude of levels. Today, roughly right after the Will Cain show here, will be the certification of Donald Trump as the next president of the United States. But later this week, Professor, it appears we will have Judge Juan Merchan in the state of New York pass down sentencing on Donald Trump in what has been described as the hush money case with Stormy Daniels. We've talked about it. I totally forgive the audience if they've forgotten the details because there was like half a dozen cases against Donald Trump. But as a refresher, Professor, this is the case where they bootstrapped misdemeanors into felonies, individually charged every single check written, much past the statute of limitations, and prosecuted something that on the face of it looks like a federal case. They made it a state case somehow after the DOJ passed on doing this case. The state of New York's like, we got it. We'll do it. So everything about it, I think you've written this, looks like it will not survive appeal. That may have to get to the Supreme Court because we don't trust neither you or I, the state of New York. But what happens before appeal? What do you think? What sentence does he get from Judge Juan Merchan?
Well, Merchan is going to land this plane where many of us thought it had to be, which is an unconditional discharge. When we were doing the coverage in New York of the trial, I noted that most of these cases would end in a conditional discharge without a jail or probation. And that's what he's going to do because it won't trip the wire of the Constitution. But what was notable about this case is how long he waited. He could have held this hearing weeks ago and allowed Trump time to appeal. He intentionally waited until he's going to do this 10 days before the inauguration. That does not give time for appeal. But then he added a rather menacing aspect to his order. He said, if I am delayed in sentencing, I may have no choice but to do what Bragg wants, which is to hold this in suspension for 4 years. So that would allow him to hold a leash on the American president, this New York trial judge in Manhattan, for 4 years. And I think that this is planned. You could call it passive aggressive, but it's rather actively aggressive. I mean, it is a very clear effort of his part to say, you better not appeal because I could do something worse. But what he will give all of these lawfare warriors is he will allow them to say that Trump is the first convicted felon to be sworn into office as president. Now, of course, that's ignoring the fact that he's never had a chance to appeal the heart of this case. He's had other appeals, but he's never been able to appeal the many errors that Merchan made, and he's never been able to really appeal this absurd theory. Even the CNN senior analyst called this an absurd case. The Democratic senator from New Jersey called it BS, and that's the case that they are trying to push to finish before the inauguration.
So, there was a time when he didn't sentence Donald Trump, and it was almost like, does he get credit for not doing this before the election, right? Like, if he does before the election, it could be seen as trying to, do what they were doing, interfering in the election. But do you think the sweet spot was he should have passed sentencing shortly after the election or after Donald Trump won, providing time for appeal? But what he's done by delaying is hold this over Donald Trump's head, keeping him from appealing, and now setting it up so when he's inaugurated, it's with the caveat or the talking point, first convicted felon?
Yeah, there's no reason. This is why I wrote a column saying this is the end of the longest performance of Hamlet off Broadway. I mean, he's been debating what type of judge he will be. He made a just horrendous mess out of this case. I mean, this case should have been dismissed at the outset. It's absurd. But then he's let this linger for years. And I was not nearly as harsh on Mershon until I sat in his courtroom and watched him at that trial. I was shocked at how nonsensical some of his rulings were. At one point I let out a sort of guffaw, and he sort of glared at me because it was really not intentional, just because it was a ruling on an objection from the Trump people, which was absolutely obviously true, and he just rejected it, and I couldn't believe it. But he had an agenda, I think, in this case. He was not going to give a fair trial to the former president. And in the meantime, he gagged the leading candidate for the presidency. So you have this acting justice in this little court in Manhattan who not only gagged the leading candidate for president, but is threatening that he may hold a leash on him for 4 years. That would mean that all of his orders would continue to run.
Wait, so last thing with you, Professor. I'm curious. I haven't heard you say this before. So, and you probably have, but so you're sitting in the courtroom, and that's the first time you could really sense how unfair this entire thing was. Well, I mean, so it was the sort of what I understood you saying is it's sort of like what are on their face seemingly small objections, but obvious ones that all went against the Trump team that showed you like this guy is just he's an antagonist. He's on one side of this deal. Was it that? Was it body language?
Yeah,
what was it that made you all of a sudden go, oh my gosh?
Yeah, there's an objection to one of the questions by the prosecution, which, by the way, the objection was consistent with what Mershon had said previously, and it was consistent with the law. The prosecution was off the map on that question, and it should have been a very easy thing to say, of course, sustained. And instead, I couldn't believe my ears when he rejected it. And unfortunately, that was not unique. There was a series of these decisions. Mm-hmm. The worst decision that he made, of course, besides keeping this case at all, was he said that the jury didn't have to agree on what happened. He said that the way this novel theory works, that they were able to zap dead misdemeanors back into life, is they needed a secondary crime, a crime that was being concealed. That's pretty important, right? But he said that the jurors didn't have to agree on what happened. They didn't have to agree on what Trump was trying to hide. So you could have a 4-4-4 jury. You could literally have groups of 4 that saw this case completely differently. And he's saying you don't have to be unanimous on that. Just give me the verdict that says guilty. And that's what they did.
Well, we'll have to see this week. It's going to be a busy week. That's one of the things we have to watch. You've written about free speech. The book is The Indispensable Right, Free Speech in the Age of Rage. It's on sale now. It's a great way to start your new year. It's Jonathan Turley.